Hello there, everybody, and you're very welcome to our latest As I Am community support webinar supported by SuperValu. And this is our way at this time in trying to continue to reach you and provide you with support on some of the key issues facing the autism community during COVID-19. During this crisis, we've been focusing naturally on the needs of autistic people in a wide variety of settings, from dealing with changes to school and work life to coping with the lack of opportunities to self-regulate and finding ways to fight boredom. But today, what we wanted to do is really respond to a trend in the correspondence we're seeing within the organisation, which is as more and more of the supports that people would usually offer have been unavailable. We've seen a lot of parents and carers reach out to us in recent times, really, really struggling. And of course, one of the things we know is you can't support somebody else, you can't care for somebody else unless you actually care for yourself in the first instance. We wanted to really today, as a result, make this webinar about parents, about carers, and about how it is okay to ask for help at this time and ways in which you can try and mind yourself during this unprecedented and incredibly challenging time that is the COVID-19 pandemic. We're absolutely delighted that Dr. Eddie Murphy has agreed to join us for this conversation today. Many people will know Eddie from Operation Transformation and the Irish Independent, amongst other publications, and very involved in the non-for-profit space yourself, and have done a lot of work in supporting carers. So I want to thank you for joining us today, Eddie, and we'd love to hear, I suppose, at the outset, how you think this present crisis is affecting carers and parents.
Yeah, thanks very much, Adam. It's lovely to I am, and compliments to the need really of families and carers, and the challenges and struggles with, particularly with I suppose, so my back, just to explain, obviously people might know me from doing that work, but I work in the HSC. I'm head of psychology, and I understand the massive demand, the lack of capacity, the families struggling to get transition assessments, all the rest of it, and then with children out of school now and out of sync, and queries over July provision and all the rest of it, that there's significant challenges for parents and carers. And I suppose what I'd like to do is, in our conversation today, is I'd like people to be at the end of this conversation, that they could come away with one nugget, something very practical toolkit that they could use to make change for themselves straight away, so that they can support others. And that's what one of the things that we hopefully we can, that's our goal by the end of today, that if we could maybe do a slight level of reprioritization, where the family member care takes a little bit of time to nurture and look after themselves.
Absolutely. And I think that actually opens up, I think, a really interesting place to start the conversation, because one of the questions we received was a person wondering how should they manage that sense of guilt when during this time they create a little bit of time for themselves, as opposed to just focusing on the person that they're supporting. How does an individual manage that guilt? I know from traveling around the country, parents and carers are some of the most committed people in this area, and they're always on the front lines, and never want to say no or think about themselves. So how do you manage that sense of guilt so many people feel?
Yeah, interesting. Now, from a psychology point of view, guilt is one of the, it's so if I understand the question, a person is actually taking the time and is not engaged in the structure, routine, or whatever, the caregiving piece, and now they're feeling guilty about that. Actually, guilt is one of the most challenging emotions. When we talk about our emotions, in life we've 5 major emotions. And if you think of a child under 5, the major emotions are fear, happiness, sadness, anger, and disgust. They're the 5 primary emotions. And as we get older, our emotions and our brain gets more complex, our emotions get more complex. So fear, when it sort of escalates, and you can think about adolescents and adults and older adults, fear can be a panic attack when it gets problematic, anxiety, generalized anxiety, health anxiety, worrying about your health, OCD. But it fundamentally goes back to fear as an emotion. And guilt, you can see, is one of these really it emerges as our brain gets more complex.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about, I think the opposite of guilt is self-compassion. If you're doing something that is a self-care piece, rather than, and guilt, all our emotions, Adam, are driven by what we're thinking. So for example, today I'm going, first time I'm meeting Adam Harris, and I'm going, oh, I hope this goes well. This is the thoughts. So there's a sense of hope. But if it was fear, I'd be going, if I was coming to this place in a fearful place, I could be saying, oh, I hope I don't stumble over my words today. I hope I get my message across really well. I hope you can hear that sort of fear narrative going on. And when it comes to guilt, it's like a guilt narrative that's driven by our thoughts is, I should be doing this. I shouldn't be enjoying myself. I should be doing this with my son or daughter. I should be doing this. And the opposite of that is self-compassion. Having self-compassion, saying it's okay. It's okay to take a moment. It's okay to, sometimes I need to step off the treadmill to be able to step back on it. In fact, so many parents with family members with on the spectrum are fighting all the time because they're trying to fight for resources. It's exhausting. Like what we find is that families are just exhausted and stressed and worried and anxious. So if you're able to take this, for this person that sent in this question, if you're taking that moment, then self-compassion is one of the spaces where you'd work with.
I think that's really interesting, because I guess that's about getting people into the right frame of mind, about thinking about themselves, about beginning to explore how they can do this. I think one of the things that has come up, and it's a question I received today, is how do you find that balance? So I suppose what's sometimes interesting is, I think for any parent, any carer, at times things can get overwhelming, things can get stressful. It's important for people to make time for themselves. Within the autism community, I suppose is the challenge that sometimes, we have parents and carers who are by themselves, and we have people who maybe are supporting people who really struggle to do many basic things for themselves without a lot of input and support. How do you think a carer can find small ways practically to get that balance right?
Okay, so I at the moment I'm actually doing a lot of talks around well-being for organizations and uh, well, how to manage them, through this COVID period, how you can manage your levels of stress and anxiety. I've done this for a lot of organizations, and what I've generally asked is, and I'll ask the viewers or listeners, is to rate your levels of stress. And I've done this on Zoom calls with hundreds of people, is quite a significant, because of the COVID period and if you want the way the structure and the routine has been totally thrown up in the air, the levels of stress are quite significantly high. So when it comes to stress and self-care, really it goes back to first principles around, and I would always say the quickest win to somebody, to your self-care, is sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Sleep, yeah. Because a lot of people actually are not getting, even before this COVID crisis, a lot of people aren't getting enough sleep. And if you want the quickest win, it's like a buffer zone. Sometimes I think like a traffic light model, red, amber, green. And if I asked your, viewers to look at this and, where am I? Am I in the green zone? Well, that means you're doing something really well. Keep it going. Am I in the amber zone? So I'm a little bit at risk, or I'm in the red zone. I'm sort of, I'm now going to deplete, and I could get unwell, or physically unwell, or emotionally unwell. So what zone are you in? And then how can you, as you asked me, what self-care activities can you engage in? But the first quickest win is sleep, because it's restorative. It's something that we need to support ourselves. Nutrition, reducing our alcohol. We know now that alcohol intake has increased through this period. It's reducing your alcohol intake. Physical exercise. There's, nature is the best medicine. Physical activity, walking, has really a powerful way of supporting our emotional well-being, our stress levels. It's normal to feel stressed. In fact, we can't live in a world without stress. Stress is something that we all need to get us up in the morning. But it's how we react to stress and what coping mechanisms we have, and sometimes and what resilience we have in advance of stress. So a good network of support helps us buffer against stress. But the challenge is to enhance that our resilience is to enhance our physical exercise, sleep, nutrition, and then later on we'll talk about good maybe psychology tools to enhance our self-care.
I think one thing that you just touched on there that's really interesting is that concept of good stress versus bad stress. Because I think one of the things that certainly is a reality for a lot of our families at the moment is fear, because I think what we've been seeing, of course, is a 24/7 news cycle that's all about death, danger, a lack of hope into the future sometimes. And I suppose when you're in a scenario at the same time where you're supporting someone and you're worried about, what if I get sick? What if they get sick? What if somebody has to self-isolate or someone has to go to hospital by themselves? I suppose one of the things that is really challenging is how do you identify what are the things that I should invest in worrying about, and what are the things that I should realize that maybe are beyond my control? Would you have any suggestions or thoughts in that regard?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things I'd say is really reduce the amount of the news cycle, that 24-hour news cycle. My view is, in fact, I stopped listening to the news now, and I was a bit of a news junkie. But because if something happens in this COVID pandemic, you will be told about it. There's no doubt about it, right? So you don't necessarily need to dip in so regularly. You will be told about it, and but go to one authoritative resource and get the news that you need, and then just move it on. I think then engage in other stuff in your life, but the behavior, the psychology is interesting around this, because we, in a sense, see that's scanning. If fear is the emotion, we scan and we look at news cycles, and we're trying to absorb news and look at information, and that's all about trying to get a sense of control. And through this, there's some really interesting papers on this, and through this period, everybody collectively put the shoulder to the wheel, and there was a sense of mobilization. And but now we're through that period, and disillusionment is now emerged as a theme. There's a disillusionment and exhaustion. A lot of people are in that a disillusionment and exhausted phase. The British Psychological Society had a paper on this, very interesting, looking at the different phases of the pandemic. And I think that's where we're at now. There's a frustration, there's an agitation, and people want things in a way to come back to a normal, particularly around schooling and supports for children. That's where I think some of the biggest concerns would be, and for the autism community, that is certainly a huge factor around the re-establishment of the supports that are required. And so that's one of the things. Sorry, the second part of your question there, Adam, was, I know one was around the news cycle. Hope. You talked about hope, and hope is the antidote to fear, just as compassion is the antidote to guilt. If the opposite, and particularly despair and sadness, and hope is incredibly important. We all keep a sense of hope, and that fear of being well or unwell, or if I get unwell, or if I have to self-isolate, but it goes back to the circles of a circle of control, a circle of influence, and your circle of concern. So if Adam Harris is concerned about all the supports for families and individuals with in the autism community, he could get overwhelmed by that, being in that circle of concern. But if Adam focuses on his circle of control and his circle of influence, at least then he can sort of it can be a little bit more containing. It can feel more containing. Just as I am concerned about mental well-being right through our community, from children to, from all children, all adolescents, all young adults, all adults, and all older adults. My concern is that we have a society that has well-being at its core. But if I spend all my time in that, I'd be overwhelmed, and I can just focus on what little bit can I do to nudge that forward.
Absolutely. And I think that concept of what can we do is really interesting, because I think there's probably two elements to it. I mean, one of the things certainly we would have noticed when the crisis first began, a lot of the sort of emails we typically receive as an organization, they stopped coming for a few weeks because everyone was just in survival mode, and we're really just focused on, school finishing, getting set up, dealing with work, talking to banks about their financial situations, all those sort of things kicked in. But then there was, I think, a point in time where people really began to feel the strain of being in that kind of pressure cooker all day long, where we're with each other all day long, where we're trying to balance each other's needs all day long. And certainly for me, when I remember coming back to the office after the Easter long weekend, where a lot of people were at home for 4 days without anything to do. And they really were beginning to see the strain of that. People not coping, that there was no routine. People upset that the places they usually go at the weekend weren't open. People feeling that there was just nowhere in the house maybe to go to get 5 minutes peace and quiet. So I suppose when people are in those sort of pressure cooker environments at the moment that I think a lot of people find themselves in, would you have any suggestions or strategies in terms of, I suppose we talk a lot about what we do when a crisis happens, but how we can maybe prevent that happening and maybe calm the environment down somewhat?
Well, structure and routine are important, but I do think having actually physical time, if possible, away, a free time moment actually, so that individuals in the house have a free time, and that maybe it's a time where kids can choose to do what they want. It does, whether it does, even though we're massively concerned about the amount of screen time and stuff like that children would be on, but having physical time away, I think would be, so it could be in another room, or you go out for a walk, or particularly now that the weather's a bit decent and stuff like that, you could head out and just sit under a tree, or connect with nature or something. Something like that, to just give a physical bit of solitude. Actually, can maybe support, because I'm finding that's a space, just a time for yourself.
I think picking up on one of the things that you said there, that we've been trying, I suppose, to remind autistic people and carers and families as well, is I suppose changing our expectations of ourselves at the moment. I think what we're finding from a lot of families, for example, I know primary school children are still maybe receiving materials from school. There's a lot of families really, really worried about, my child is going to regress, my child is going to miss out, my child is going to fall behind other children. And as a result, maybe the parents putting themselves under a lot of stress and pressure, or even in some maybe a child being put under huge pressure because maybe they're not able to do the same amount of work in the home environment that they would in the school environment. So how important do you think being kind to yourself is at the moment?
Incredibly important. But what I would say is sometimes we need to focus on human being, not human doing. Because if you think about it, you hear someone they're up in the morning, they've done an exercise class, and they've done an aerobics class, and they've done their home tutoring, and now they're learning an instrument, and then they're learning a foreign language, and they're doing. Sometimes it's just about stepping back and being. Yeah. And we're not teachers, for many people aren't teachers, so we can't expect to. I just think we need to just pull back on those expectations. Uh-huh. I need educationists I've talked to said that they will get the children back up to speed again. I have two boys, 12 and 10. Be concerned about them. Haven't done as much work as it comes in and out and stuff like that. But your house has to judge it for themselves. If you're engaged in like working from home, Zoom calls. People have Zoom fatigue now if they're engaged and lucky enough to be working at one level. Then home tutoring and doing and doing and doing. Just being, human being, rather than human doing. That's a good title for this podcast.
Yes, I like it. I really like it. And I guess the second part of what you just said is, we're in phase 2 now. Things seem to be opening up a little bit quicker. Certainly, a lot of the time, our organization is focused on over the last couple of weeks is trying to secure a July provision program that will meet the needs
Yeah.
of autistic young people.
And you know what? That's going to be very important. And I lend my support to that because for a number of different reasons. One, it's needed. Two, families are looking for it. Three, obviously, from a child-centered point of view, if you look at the work of the Ombudsman for Children and all of that, there's a need for. But also too, it'll set good learning for this going back to schools in September as well. So that's another good reason.
Hugely, because I guess the return to routine is something a lot of families are worried about. I think the families we've heard from so far, we kind of would maybe divide into two categories. People who are not coping now and finding it incredibly difficult. Maybe in some instances, people really not understanding what's happening at present, and that's very hard for everyone to manage. In other instances, actually, people reporting my son or daughter is less stressed than they usually are. They aren't having the sort of demands of the school day or of the sensory environment that they usually would.
Yeah.
They're in their safe place, but it's going to be really hard as a result to get back to where we were.
And the interesting, the paradoxical bit of the child that has the demands are less now, so they're actually less anxious, and the concern of the parent going into the school. But that would depend on the developmental age and stage of the child, and around social stories, would be very important for that younger child, and a conversation and discussion, and I tried to figure out the fears, and then but parents know best. Parents are know their sons and daughters best, and I would say that it's very difficult, because if your parent is trying to forecast something that they've no real sense of, it's the ambiguity, and I suppose people struggle with ambiguity. People struggle with the absence of a clear plan and pathway. So that's the and trying to, in a way, create an understanding that life isn't black and white, that there's a level of ambiguity and change, and that's I suppose for all individuals, knowing that change is the norm, as opposed to the as things generally don't stay still.
Absolutely. You spoke a little bit there about the idea of a kind of psychological toolkit or some practical strategies that people could maybe draw upon at this time. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so when we think about stress, quite often actually, when we think about stress, we often say, like, change the situation. But this is one situation that we can't change. We can't. Some people actually over time they do this. They might change location or change their. I've often seen people who've changed country even, and because they feel that one place is better than another. But people actually bring the same mindset. Change our thoughts about the situation. That gives us a real ground for work. Is there another way I can think about this situation? What's the best thing I can do for me right now? What am I reacting to? Sort of a number of key questions that can generate generate us thinking about levels of stress, and how in a year's time will this matter, so that we're really getting a sort of some form of a distance from, and trying to use some thinking strategies. For then it could be around coping strategies. And one thing what's interesting is if you ask people what are they doing, so it could be what's their go-to, like, around stress management. Is it time alone? Is it listening to the radio, music? Is it talking to friends? what is it? And what if I, for some people it could be a glass of wine at the weekend, but hopefully not too much. But what is it that, is it what's your go-to around stress management? And then, are you going to it enough? Are you engaged in enough self-care activities? And then, can you stretch that repertoire of self-care activities? And that's really around trying to support ourselves in areas of stress and acknowledging the stress,
Mm-hmm.
acknowledging that for being a carer or parent, it is a stressful place.
Mm-hmm.
And that acknowledgement and understanding can be connecting with an organization as I am, is connecting and getting supports, feeling part of a community, feeling part of a tribe that understand me, get me.
Mm-hmm.
They, you know, that you're not necessarily uh, talking to people who you feel don't understand you or don't have that lived experience. Whereas that connecting with the different groups that have the lived experience can give us a sense of connection. But also to be mindful in that too, that you're not overwhelmed by it, that your narrative isn't just within one world,
Mm-hmm.
that you're broader as a person, that you're not defined by a label, or your family isn't defined by a label. Like, you're not defined by the label of being a carer. That is just maybe one hat you wear, but it's not the only hat you wear.
I think it's been quite interesting because, of course, there's been a brilliant series on RTE the last couple of weeks looking at the experiences of carers as well. And I think that is very much part of maybe at the core of all of these issues, that for so many people who are in that caregiving role, it can become an identity in many senses, doesn't it?
It can become an identity, and I, it's so. The problem is if you, for some, it can be an over-identification, because when they lose that role, it can be problem. It can be very destabilizing for the individual. So it's about saying yes. At times I do this, but there's other times that I'm Eddie Murphy and I go out and I run,
Yeah.
or I whatever, I do different things.
Yeah, I think that's a really important message, and people feeling that, giving themselves the permission, I think, to be but more than just any one thing as well. I think it's something that maybe people can
Yeah.
feel not empowered to do sometimes. One question we got in was just in relation to, I suppose, building on the things you've spoken about. If there was any particular apps or online resources that you would recommend to support people in managing their well-being and mental
So Lust for Life is a mental well-being charity that's got some interesting essays, and they have a space there for non-verbal. They have an artistic sort of space where people can, where it's called Where Words Fail,
health?
and so that's a space where people can look at some and be engaged in some creative artistic space. That's a lustforlife.com. Obviously, Headspace and Calm are two pretty good. There's a Tackle Your Feelings. It's looks at by Rugby Players Ireland, actually. It's a mental well-being app that promotes positive psychology around confidence and a number of different areas that I was involved early in, and sort of interesting app as well. So of there's some tools that people can use. Local libraries then would have, each local library has a health and well-being section, and there's a number of different books in there that people, and libraries are opening up now actually again.
Yeah.
Um, so there's some sort of reading materials and websites and etc.
This next question is a challenging one, and it's probably a challenging one at any time. Many families maybe feel under supported at the moment. Maybe some families feel they're really not coping. I know some of the community services have had to be diverted away. A lot of families, maybe the support they receive from the state really comes through the education system in the form of SNA support or things like that. I know we're talking about July provision starting up. I know some of the SNAs have been redeployed as of this week, but there might be a lot of people who just feel they're not coping. And a message we've been trying to get out there is it's okay to feel like that. And, you know, certainly organizations like ours are still open for business and are keen to signpost you and support you. But I suppose more from a health-based approach, if people feel they're not coping or that they need support, what would you recommend that they do?
So the sense is that if they personally feel overwhelmed, well, to me, it depends where they're at in that cycle, Adam. Like it could be that a person continue, like I suspect that many families, well, I know many families aren't getting the support that they need.
Uh-huh.
So it's like, so it feels to me like a tipping point,
Mhm.
that this is more the absence of this pulling the rug now as acted as a tipping point for families.
Mhm.
And I suppose it's very important at many different levels, at the individual level, that the people just engage in self-care, self-compassion, and saying, I can do the best I can. Um, that they engage maybe in with organizations like yourself, support to do the advocacy, so that you can articulate the need for not just the individual, but for the community. And then as a society, we got to ask significant questions. Actually,
Mhm.
we got to say, uh, what do we want in a post-COVID society?
Mhm.
What are our priorities? What are our priorities for our citizens, that have so that equality exists for each citizen? And so that, you know, and that's done. That might sound, but that's at that societal level. But for that individual, it's about focusing back onto the circle of control. What can I do? Can I manage? What do I need to get through to today, not next week, whatever. So that, what do I need to do to get through today? What can make the day the best I can? How do I, worry is future focused. Regret is past focused. What can I do in the now for today? And that's when a person stays in that space, there's less likely. But we've got to do better as a society. We got to, from an education and particularly from a health point of view. I see it more from, I'm in the health space, and I just know that we are just not making the gains that we need to be making.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things you said there is really interesting because, you know, there's so many negatives at the moment and they're so clear. And within the system itself, they're so clear. I guess one of the things we always try and look at, and as I am, is what are the opportunities as well?
Yeah,
Certainly as an autistic person, I've seen some significant opportunities that arise out of COVID-19 from the point of view of, you know, not everything about the old normal was fair. You know, I'm thinking in particular of things like many people who maybe struggle to work in office environments, who struggle with job interviews or wearing a particular type of clothing. And they've shown that they can contribute, that we all can contribute by doing things in a different way. I guess from the point of view of parents and carers, do you see any opportunities that arise out of the COVID-19 pandemic and how we come out of it? It's a big question.
we'll just go back there. Divergence and I had another word there, where people can work from home, wear different clothes. But I often think there's many pathways. We push people through a particular pathway in life, but there are many great thinkers, great contributors that don't necessarily go through that main road in life. That those side roads, and there's a struggle for parents, but for society, we need people that have taken divergent pathways.
Mhm.
Diversity needs to be celebrated a bit too, because it's through that diversity that new thinking comes about.
Yeah.
Uh, so, in terms of opportunities, Adam, for parents and carers, I'm not sure really, because I just think if we accept the old status quo, we'll just go back
Yeah.
to the 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 the, the fighting for resources. Whereas if we can just figure out ways to support parents so they can be more parent than carer, that they can be more parent than teacher, that they can be more parent and fun, and not necessarily have to be always on
Yes.
in that other space, then we've achieved something.
Absolutely.
I don't know, but that's what I'd like to see happening.
I think there's been so much said and will have been learned and heard today. I guess as a kind of final question, if people listening to this were to just take one message away, what would you like it to be?
I'd like it to be around self-care and compassion, and that the importance of, if you're engaged in caring for others, part of that is about caring for yourself. And that sometimes that care for yourself is also about supporting the problem solving of others.
Mm-hmm.
That sometimes we can overcare,
Mm-hmm.
and overcare ends up de-skilling
Mm-hmm.
and individuals. So sometimes we gotta just it's about looking after ourselves, levels of self-compassion, self-care, and the key message, like we said earlier on, is you can't pour from an empty cup.
Absolutely. I want to thank you so much for giving up your time today to share this message with parents and carers. And for anyone listening who I suppose today's webinar has raised issues or concerns or ideas or questions for, you can get in touch with us, of course, on asiam.ie. And on our homepage of our website, you'll find our COVID hub, which is filled with everything from social stories to webinars like this to various different tools and templates. So do check that out. Do stay in touch. And once again, thank you very much, SuperValu, for making today's webinar possible. So thank you so much, Eddie.
Thank you, Adam.